Hi, and welcome to our GCP-Mindset channel. Today, we are going to talk about the clinical performance requirements under the new IVDR regulation. More after intro.
Welcome to everyone today, and thanks a lot for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation to join to this webinar. Today, we are going to talk about the clinical performance requirements regarding with the new IVD regulation. So during the first part of this presentation, we are going to see which are the main changes introduced with the new regulation. Afterwards, we are going to see which are the new requirements related with the clinical evidence. And finally, we are going to see how has changed the performance evaluation process, and we are going to see which are the main elements that compose this process. So, the scientific validity, the analytical performance, and the clinical performance. So, the medical device and in vitro diagnostical medical device play a fundamental role in saving lives because they provide innovative healthcare solutions for diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, and prognosis of different diseases. The Regulation 745 of 2017 states the regulatory framework related with the in vitro diagnostical medical devices. For example, when and how conduct performance evaluation studies, and also with the process related with the commercialization of these devices. This regulation was published in May of 2017, with 5 years of transition period. So recently, in May of this year, this regulation entered in force. Among the main changes introduced with this regulation, the reclassification according to the risk and the new requirements related with the clinical evidence are most of the most relevant requirements. Now, we are going to see how has changed the classification regarding to the previous directive. So, most of the IVDs regulated under the previous directive, the Directive 98/79, received low-risk classification. And only 0.9% of these devices receive high-risk classification. With the implementation of the IVDR, now is the opposite. So, only the 15.9% of these devices receive low-risk classification, and nearly of the 84.9% of these devices receive high-risk classification. So the question is, why has changed the classification on this way? Well, because the classification criteria has changed, and now the classification is based on the risk that the device implies for the patient and for the general population. This is the first reason. The second reason is because now the notified bodies play a more active role in the processes to obtain the CE mark for these devices. So, indeed, currently there are several notified bodies under the IVDR designation. This is the process that habilitates the notified bodies for overseeing the IVDs during the process to obtain the CE mark. So, the implementation of the IVDR has bring many changes that make an impact not only for the manufacturers, but also for other stakeholders. For example, the notified bodies. An example that illustrates very good the change in the regulatory criteria are the SARS-CoV-2 diagnostic tests. These tests were not listed in the previous directive, and then they were classified as a low level, or they have the lowest level of regulatory scrutiny. So this means that the notified bodies were not involved in the process to obtain the CE mark for these devices. Now, with the implementation of the IVDR, these devices receive the highest risk classification, so the Class D. They were classified as a Class D because they are used for diagnostic or high-risk pathogens, and it has a big impact in the risk for the patient and for the general population. So, as they were classified as a Class D, now the notified bodies are involved during the process to obtain the CE mark of these devices. What does this mean in practical terms for the manufacturers? So, as I mentioned, the IVDR brings a lot of restructuration, for example, in the reclassification of the devices, and it has a big impact for different stakeholders. For example, what it means for the manufacturers? Well, this implies that if one device is classified as a high risk, it requires the access of the notified bodies for assuring the manufacturing and the quality control process. This in order to assure the safety and the compliance with the IVDR. We already saw how has changed the classification according to the risk with the new IVDR. Now, we are going to see which are the new requirements regarding the clinical evidence with this new regulation. Let's start to see what means clinical evidence. How can we define it? So clinical evidence is the combination of sufficient amount and quality of clinical data and performance evaluation results that allows to qualify a given device if this device really achieves the intended clinical benefit, or in other words, the intended purpose. Let's continue with our example with the SARS-CoV-2 diagnostic test. The intended purpose of these devices is the identification or the detection of the antigen virus in infected patients. This is the goal that the manufacturer wants with these devices. So, the second question is, how does the manufacturer for answering this question? Well, they answer this question through the performance evaluation. The performance evaluation is the process that allows to get sufficient amount and quality of the clinical data. Recently, with the implementation of the IVDR, the performance evaluation has been redefined as the assessment and analysis of data to establish the scientific validity and the analytical and clinical performance of a device. What does this mean? This means that the performance evaluation process has three main components: the scientific validity, the analytical performance, and the clinical performance. We are going to see in our context or in our example with the SARS-CoV-2 diagnostic test the meaning of these concepts. The first concept, the scientific validity, by definition, is the association of an analyte with a clinical condition or physiological state. In our context, this will be the association of the virus antigen in ill patients. The second element is the analytical performance. This, by definition, is the ability to correctly detect or measure a particular analyte. For example, the specificity and the sensibility of the test. So how accurate this test can detect the really positive patient and how accurate this test can detect the really negative patients, for example. And the third element is the clinical performance. The clinical performance is the ability to produce results correlated with a particular clinical condition or physiological process. In our context, it will be the identification of the virus antigen by the test in infected patients. Together, the results obtained from the scientific validity, the analytical performance, and the clinical performance provide the evidence for get the conformity of an in vitro diagnostical medical device. We already saw the three principal elements that compose the performance evaluation process. So now I would like to focus in the clinical performance. The previous directive, the Directive 98/79, didn't put much emphasis in the clinical performance data. This regulation or this directive was more focused in the scientific and analytical performance data. But now, as we saw with the implementation of the IVDR, the clinical performance data play an important role in the performance evaluation process of an IVD. Basically, the clinical performance data are necessary to establish or confirm compliance with the general safety and performance requirements of an in vitro diagnostical medical device. And the clinical performance studies should be conducted when this safety cannot be demonstrated by other sources, for example, by scientific validity, for example, by analytical performance studies, by literature, by previous experience of routine diagnostic tests, or even by other performance studies. If clinical performance studies should be conducted, they should be conducted in line with the international standard ISO 20916 of 2019. Also, as I mentioned, the clinical performance study should be conducted unless that the safety for this device can be demonstrated through other sources. If a clinical performance study should be conducted, the clinical performance study plan should define the rationale, objectives, design, proposed analysis, monitoring, and recording keeping of the clinical performance study. This according to the Annex 13 of the IVDR. So, in general, if clinical performance studies should be conducted, the data obtained should be documented in the clinical performance study report and used in the performance evaluation process and as a part of the clinical evidence for the in vitro diagnostical medical device. So, summarizing the topics that we have talked through this seminar, we can say that after implementation with the IVDR, The classification of the IVDs has changed, and now the classification is based on the risk that the device implies for the patient and for the general population. We can say here also that as a consequence of the restructuration of the classification of the devices, now the notified bodies play a more active role in the oversight of the process related to obtain the CE mark of these devices. We can say also that the performance evaluation process is composed for three main elements: the scientific validity, the analytical performance, and the clinical performance. We can say also that after the implementation of the IVDR, there are new clinical performance requirements. For example, the clinical performance studies, which play now an important role during the performance evaluation process.
Thanks a lot for watching. So see you next time, and please don't forget to subscribe. So bye-bye.